The sound came first. Not the clatter of cutlery or the low hum of the fluorescent lights over the counter, but the wet scrape of his voice, too close to her ear. 7:13 p.m. The linoleum floor was sticky under her worn sneakers. She felt the heat of his breath on her neck, a sour mix of stale coffee and entitlement. Just a little smile, sweetheart. It's not that hard. The man, a thick-set regular named Frank, whose checks always smelled faintly of motor oil and cheap cigars, leaned in further. His hand, resting on the back of the booth, was inches from her arm. Her name was Lena. She was 21. The tray in her left hand, heavy with 2 plates of lukewarm meatloaf and a side of fries, trembled just enough to make the gravy slosh against the ceramic rim. She held her breath, a small, silent prayer that he would just lean back, that the moment would pass. He didn't. His fingers brushed the sleeve of her uniform. "Come on. I'm a good tipper." It was a lie. He always left exactly 10%, calculated down to the penny, and always with a little speech about how service wasn't what it used to be. The bill on the table was for $10.42. She could already picture the single-dollar bill and the loose change he would leave behind. Her gaze flickered toward the front counter. Her manager, Mr. Henderson, was there, meticulously polishing a water glass with a white cloth, his back deliberately turned to booth 4. He had seen. He always saw. And he always did nothing. In the periphery, a family in the next booth stopped their conversation, the father's fork hovering over his mashed potatoes, his eyes wide before quickly looking down, suddenly fascinated by his plate. Silence was a currency in this place, and everyone paid it to avoid trouble. Outside, the low, guttural rumble of a single motorcycle passed on the wet asphalt of the main street, its sound a brief, deep tear in the fabric of the diner's oppressive quiet. It was a sound of movement, of freedom, of a world away from the sticky booth and this man's suffocating presence. The sound faded, leaving only the hum of the lights and the man's expectant breathing. "What's the matter?" he murmured, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "Cat got your tongue?" Lena took a shallow breath, shifted the weight of the tray, and forced her voice to be steady, professional. "Your food, sir." She placed the plates on the table, her movements stiff and precise, her eyes fixed on a hardened ketchup stain near the salt shaker. She did not smile. She did not look at him. She simply retreated, one step, then another, the back of her neck tingling, feeling his gaze on her like a physical weight. The shift ended at 10 p.m. Lena handed her collected cash and credit card slips to Henderson, who counted them under the dim desk lamp in his tiny office. The total was correct. He grunted his approval, never looking up from the ledger. "Lena," she said, her voice small but clear in the cramped space. He continued writing. "Henderson," she said his name again, firmer this time. He finally looked up, his expression a mask of weary impatience. "What is it?" "I got to close out," she swallowed. "It's Frank. In booth 4. He makes me uncomfortable. He's too close." Tonight he touched my arm. Henderson sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation. He put down his pen and leaned back in his squeaking chair, steepling his fingers. "Lena, Frank's been coming here for 15 years. He's a little old-fashioned, that's all. He doesn't mean anything by it." The dismissal was so casual, so practiced, it felt like a slap. "He calls me sweetheart. He waits until I'm right next to him and whispers things. It's not old-fashioned, it's..." She struggled for the word. "It's demeaning." Henderson picked up his pen again. "He's a paying customer. You're a waitress. Your job is to be polite. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill. Just smile, collect your tip, and move on. We can't afford to be running off regulars over hurt feelings." Hurt feelings. The phrase hung in the air, cheap and insulting. It wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about the cold knot of dread in her stomach every time the bell over the door chimed and she saw his bulky frame fill the doorway. It was about the way she had to plan her route through the diner to avoid his booth. Henderson slid her $84 in tips across the desk. "Go home. Get some rest. You're on the opening shift tomorrow." The conversation was over. Later that night, sitting in her small apartment, She called the police non-emergency line. She explained the situation calmly, factually. The voice on the other end was bored, detached. So, he didn't threaten you physically? He didn't prevent you from leaving? No, but, ma'am, a customer being creepy isn't a criminal offense. If he makes a direct threat or puts his hands on you in a way you deem assault, call 911. Otherwise, it's a customer service issue for your manager to handle a customer service issue. The words echoed Henderson's dismissal. The system had looked at her plea, categorized it, and filed it away under "not our problem." She hung up the phone. The silence of her apartment amplifying the feeling of being utterly, completely alone. She was a gear in a machine that was designed to keep running, and her discomfort was just friction, an annoyance to be ignored or smoothed over. The world had told her, twice in one night, that her fear was insignificant. Her world was a small, third-floor walk-up apartment that smelled of old books and chamomile tea. The rent was $450 a month, a sum that felt like a mountain she had to climb every 30 days. On the peeling paint of the wall above her second-hand desk, she had taped a photograph of her younger sister, Chloe, smiling with a gap in her teeth, holding up a first-place ribbon from a science fair. Chloe was 16 and lived with their aunt 3 states away, but she was brilliant, accepted into a summer STEM program that cost $2,000. That was Lena's mountain. Every dollar Frank didn't leave, every condescending remark from Henderson she had to swallow, was a step toward that goal. The $84 from her shift was already allocated. $50 for rent, $20 for her power bill, and $14 for groceries. The rest, what little there was, went into a chipped ceramic jar labeled Chloe's Future. Inside was just over $600 in crumpled bills. It felt like both a fortune and an insultingly small amount. On her nightstand, next to a worn copy of Cosmos by Carl Sagan, was a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay a bronze star, its purple and white ribbon faded with age. It had belonged to her grandfather, a quiet man who had served 2 tours and came home with a limp and a belief in unwavering moral clarity. He taught her that honor wasn't about grand gestures, but about doing the right thing when no one was watching. Dignity, he used to say, his voice a low rumble, is the one thing no one can take from you unless you give it away. She held the cool metal in her palm, its weight a familiar comfort. He had worked as a mechanic after the war, his hands always calloused and stained, but he treated every person who came into his shop with the same quiet respect. Whether they drove a beat-up pickup or a brand-new sedan, he would have never stood for a man like Frank. He would have never worked for a man like Henderson. She placed the metal back in its box, the memory of his integrity a painful contrast to her current reality. She was giving her dignity away, piece by piece, for $10.42 at a time. The job at the diner was supposed to be temporary, a bridge to something better. But the days had bled into weeks, the weeks into months, and the bridge seemed to be stretching longer and longer over a chasm of unpaid bills and deferred dreams. Her fear of Frank was now intertwined with the fear of losing this job, as flawed as it was. It was the only plank she had. The week that followed was a slow, grinding escalation. Frank's behavior, emboldened by the lack of consequence, grew more audacious. On Tuesday, he was there when she arrived for her shift, sitting in his car in the parking lot, watching her walk from the bus stop. He didn't wave or call out. He just watched, his presence a silent, looming threat. On Thursday, he left her a gift on the table instead of a tip. A single, wilted daisy. Its stem snapped. The gesture felt more like a warning than a kindness. Henderson had seen it and simply cleared it away with the dirty plates, his face impassive. The worst came on Friday. It was raining, a cold, miserable downpour. Her shift ended late, and she was the last to leave. As she stepped out into the dark, slick alley behind the diner, he was there, standing under the weak glow of the security light, blocking her path to the street. "Forgot your flower," he said, his voice flat. Lena froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The alley was a canyon of brick and dumpsters, the sounds of the city muffled by the rain. "Please, just let me pass," she whispered. her voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the metal dumpster lids. He took a step closer, a smirk playing on his lips. "I just want to talk." He wasn't touching her. He wasn't yelling. But the threat was absolute. Her grandfather's words about dignity echoed in her mind. She straightened her shoulders, clutched her worn backpack strap, and looked him directly in the eye. "There is nothing to talk about. Please move." For a long moment, he just stood there, the smirk fading as he seemed to realize she wasn't cowering. With a low growl of frustration, he stepped aside. "Whatever, you're not that special anyway." Lena walked past him, her legs shaking, not running until she reached the brightly lit main street. At home, trembling, she didn't cry. She opened a fresh spiral notebook. With a steady hand, she began to write. Tuesday, October 12th, 3:55 p.m. Frank parked in lot, watched me walk from bus. Did not leave until I was inside. Thursday, October 14th, 8:30 p.m. Left dead flower on table 4. No tip. Henderson saw, said nothing. Friday, October 15th, 10:17 p.m. Waited in alley. Blocked path. Said, "Forgot your flower." I asked him to move. He did. She filled 2 pages with every detail she could remember from the past weeks. Dates, times, exact quotes, who was present. It was the only thing she could control. The next day, she took the notebook to the police station. A different officer, a woman with tired eyes, listened patiently. She read Lena's notes. "This is good," the officer said, nodding. "You're documenting everything." That smart hope flickered in Lena's chest. "So you can do something?" The officer's face fell slightly. "We can file a report for harassment. But for a restraining order, a judge will need to see a clear pattern of credible threat. What you have here is a man being a persistent jerk. It's on the line. Keep documenting. If he touches you, if he makes a specific threat, I'm going to hurt you. Call 911 immediately. Until then, our hands are tied." The system had failed her again, but this time with a shred of procedural advice. Keep documenting. So she did. Her notebook became her shield, each entry a small act of defiance. There was another regular at the diner, a man who was the complete opposite of Frank. He was a large man, built like a refrigerator, with a long gray beard and hands that could palm a basketball. He always sat at the far end of the counter, took up 2 stools with his presence, and ordered the same thing every morning: black coffee and a plain bagel, toasted. He spoke little, read a worn paperback, and always left a crisp $5 bill for his $3 order. The other waitresses were a little scared of him. He wore a leather vest, even in the summer, with no visible club patches, but the unmistakable air of someone who belonged to a world of chrome and thunder. They called him Bear. Lena wasn't scared of him. She saw the way his eyes, surprisingly gentle, would crinkle at the corners when Chloe's picture, now taped by the register, caught his gaze. He never commented, never pried, but he saw it. He saw everything. He saw Frank's leering. He saw Henderson's indifference. He saw the other patrons look away. He saw the slight tremor in Lena's hand as she refilled his coffee, and he saw the forced, brittle quality of her smile. One Saturday morning, after a particularly bad shift where Frank had loudly joked to another customer about her attitude, Lena fled to the alley to compose herself, leaning against the cool brick and fighting back tears of sheer frustration. The back door creaked open. It was Bear. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, holding a clean, folded napkin. He held it out to her. "Tough day at the office," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. Lena took the napkin and wiped her eyes, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be." "You have nothing to be sorry for," he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. He looked down the alley, then back at her. "The manager, the police, they do nothing." Again, not a question. It was a statement of fact. She just nodded, unable to speak. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "My grandfather," Lena found herself saying, the words tumbling out. He was in the army. He said dignity is all you have. Bear nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Good man. He looked at the notebook peeking out of her bag. You write it all down. It's all I can do, she admitted. Sometimes, he said, his gaze intense. That's the most important thing you can do. The truth has to be written down before it can be read out loud. He stood there a moment longer, a silent, solid presence. Then he gave a short, sharp nod. You keep writing. You're doing it right. He turned and went back inside. The interaction was no more than 2 minutes. But for Lena, it was a lifeline. Someone had seen her, truly seen her, and validated her struggle. Later that night, in a quiet garage filled with the scent of oil and steel, Bear sat on a stool, his phone to his ear. It's me, he said. Yeah. Listen, there's a situation. A civilian, kid, good kid, being pushed around. Systems failing her. He listened for a moment. No, nothing like that. She's doing it by the book. Documenting. Keeping her chin up. She's got honor. There was another pause. Yeah, that's what I thought too. He looked at the gleaming chrome of the handlebar in front of him. It's time to remind people what a community looks like. Let's set a table. The call went out at 6 p.m. the following Friday. It wasn't a call to arms, but a summons to order. A series of text messages, precise and coded, rippled through the county. Table for 1. Henderson's Diner. 8 p.m. sharp. Dress code. Formal. Reading material required. Formal meant full colors. The club's cute. The leather vest that was both uniform and statement. Reading material was the unspoken part. Bring your presence, your discipline, and your silence. 7:05 p.m. Haven. A man named Stitch, a former army medic, zipped up his leather jacket over a clean black t-shirt. He checked the tire pressure on his Harley-Davidson Road Glide, his movements economical and practiced. He kissed his sleeping daughter on the forehead before quietly closing the front door. 7:18 p.m. Northgate Industrial Park. In a sprawling workshop, 5 men gathered. They were mechanics, welders, and electricians by day. Tonight they were a unit. They moved around their polished bikes, a silent choreography of preparation. No loud talk, no bravado. Just the quiet zip of jackets, the click of helmet buckles, the low grunt of a final systems check. 7:22 p.m. Route 9. A lone rider, a lawyer they called Preacher, merged onto the highway, his engine a steady, powerful thrum. He had a copy of the state's anti-stalking and harassment statutes bookmarked on his phone. 7:35 p.m. Bear's garage. He was on the phone with a contact, a young, hungry reporter at a local news station he'd once helped with a flat tire on a deserted road. I can't tell you what's going to happen, Bear said, but I can tell you that if you're at Henderson's Diner at 8 o'clock, you'll see a story about a community standing up for one of its own. No violence, no threats, just a lesson in accountability. There was a pause. Yeah. Her name is Lena. 7:45 p.m. From across 3 counties they converged. Not in one large, roaring pack, but in small groups of 2 and 3, merging seamlessly with traffic. From the Valley chapter, 12 riders. From the coast, 18. From the city's old guard, another 14. A quiet, rolling tide of chrome and black leather. The head count was 44, with more on standby. Each man knew the protocol. Park legally. No revving engines. No blocking traffic. No intimidating language. They were not a mob. They were an instrument of public scrutiny. They were there to be witnesses. Their sheer, disciplined presence a spotlight that could not be ignored. The system of silent complicity was about to be overwhelmed by a system of absolute, unwavering attention. At 7:55 p.m., Frank was in his usual booth holding court. He was telling a crude joke to another regular, his laughter booming through the quiet diner. Lena moved through the aisles, her stomach a cold, tight knot. She had seen Bear's nod, but she had no idea what it meant. She just knew that tonight, the air felt different, charged with a strange electricity. Then came the sound. It started as a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more than heard. It wasn't the angry roar of a single bike, but a deep, resonant chord, the sound of dozens of engines synchronized. Heads began to turn. Patrons near the windows looked out, their eyes widening. The hum grew into a ground-shaking rumble that vibrated the coffee cups in their saucers. Frank stopped his joke mid-sentence, a confused look on his face. "What the hell is that?" Henderson came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his face pale. Through the large plate-glass windows they saw them. One by one, then two by two, motorcycles began to pull into the parking lot. They weren't roaring in. They were rolling, their movements slow and deliberate. A line of them, headlights cutting through the dusk, turned in from the main street. They filled the parking spaces in perfect, disciplined rows, like a cavalry unit lining up for inspection. There was no chaos, no aggression, just immaculate, overwhelming order. 44 bikes. Then the riders dismounted in near unison. They were large men, dressed in worn leather vests adorned with the club's emblem. They didn't speak. They didn't look at the diner. They simply formed a silent, unmoving perimeter around the parking lot. Some stood by their bikes, arms crossed. Others lined the sidewalk, their backs to the street, facing the diner. They were not blocking the entrance. They were simply bearing witness. A car from the local news station pulled up across the street, a cameraman getting out and setting up a tripod. The red light on his camera began to blink. Inside the diner, a hush had fallen. The only sound was the clatter of a fork dropped by a startled patron. Frank's face had gone from confusion to a pasty, slack-jawed fear. He seemed to shrink in his seat. Henderson stood frozen by the register, his eyes darting between the silent army outside and the news camera across the street. The community of complicity had vanished. In its place was a community of accountability, silent, patient, and impossible to ignore. The door chimed. Bear stepped inside. He moved with a quiet deliberation that made him seem even larger. He didn't look at Frank. He didn't look at Henderson. His eyes found Lena, who stood by the coffee machine, her tray held against her chest like a shield. He walked toward her, his heavy boots making no sound on the sticky floor. The entire diner held its breath. He stopped a few feet from her. "Lena," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble that carried through the silence. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return, a gesture that said, "We are here for you." Then he turned his attention to the manager. He walked to the counter where Henderson stood, paralyzed. Bear placed a thin manila folder on the countertop. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "Henderson," Bear said, his voice calm and level, devoid of any anger. The news camera zoomed in through the window. "This folder contains a meticulously kept log." He tapped the folder with a thick finger. "It details 53 separate instances of harassment against one of your employees by a customer, Mr. Frank Turner," he said Frank's full name, and Frank flinched in his booth as if struck. "It includes dates, times, direct quotes, and a list of witnesses who chose not to intervene." Bear paused, letting the words sink in. "It also contains a copy of a formal harassment complaint filed with the local police precinct, which was dismissed without action, and a second record of a follow-up visit where the advice given was to keep documenting." He slid the folder a few inches closer to the terrified manager. "Furthermore, it contains public records. 2 prior restraining orders filed against Mr. Turner in a neighboring county for similar behavior, both of which he violated. It also contains a list of 3 health and safety code violations for this establishment that our research happened to uncover. Grease trap maintenance is 3 months overdue. By the way." Frank, from his booth, finally found his voice, a pathetic, blustering squeak. "This is ridiculous. I'm a regular here. You can't." His voice trailed off as Bear slowly turned his head and met his gaze. Bear said nothing. He didn't have to. The combined weight of 44 silent men outside, the unblinking eye of the camera, and the cold, hard facts in the folder had already passed judgment. The manager, Henderson, looked from the folder to the camera, his face a mask of crumbling authority. The mask dropped. He began to stammer. I didn't know. The truth, written down in Lena's neat, steady hand, was finally being read aloud. The flashing blue and red lights arrived less than 10 minutes later, painting the faces of the silent bikers in strobing colors. 2 police cruisers pulled into the lot, parking behind the news van. This time, however, the officers who stepped out did not have bored, dismissive expressions. They were a sergeant and 2 patrol officers, their movements crisp, their faces serious. They had seen the live news feed. The sergeant entered the diner, his eyes taking in the scene. The terrified manager, the shrinking harasser, the large, calm man at the counter, and the young waitress standing by the coffee machine, watching everything. "What's the situation here?" the sergeant asked, his voice carrying the authority that had been absent from Lena's previous encounters with the law. Bear simply tapped the folder. "This young lady has been the victim of a prolonged harassment campaign. It's all documented." The sergeant picked up the folder and began to read. He read Lena's clear, concise entries. He saw the dates, the times, the escalating pattern. He saw the copies of the prior restraining orders. He looked over at Frank, whose face was slick with sweat. He then looked at Lena. "Is this your log, ma'am?" "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady. The sergeant nodded. He walked over to booth 4. "Mr. Turner, I need you to step outside with me. We have some questions for you." Frank's bluster was gone, replaced by a pleading whine. "It's a misunderstanding. I'm the victim here. These thugs came here to intimidate me." The sergeant's face was stone. "The only thing I see intimidating you, sir, is a folder full of evidence and a news camera. Let's go." As the officers escorted a sputtering Frank out to the patrol car, Henderson, seeing his world collapsing, rushed toward Lena. "Lena, I am so sorry," he began, his voice slick with manufactured sincerity. "There will be changes. We'll have a staff meeting. Frank is banned, of course. Permanently." Bear held up a hand, silencing him. "She's owed more than an apology. She's owed her back pay for every tip that man withheld. And she's owed a safe place to work." Henderson nodded frantically. "Yes, of course, whatever it takes." The police car, with Frank in the back, pulled away from the curb. The red tail lights disappeared down the street. A great, unseen weight seemed to lift from the entire diner. The bikers outside did not cheer or celebrate. They had been a force of pure potential, a promise of action that made action unnecessary. They watched until the police car was gone. Then, as one, they turned, mounted their motorcycles, and started their engines. The sound was not a roar of triumph, but the same unified, disciplined rumble. They pulled out of the parking lot as orderly as they had arrived, their headlights vanishing into the night, leaving behind only the stunned silence and the blinking red light of the news camera. Lena stood by the window watching them go. She didn't know their names, but she knew their character. She felt a profound, aching sense of gratitude. She looked over at Bear, who was preparing to leave. He simply met her gaze from across the room and gave a slow, respectful nod. No words were needed. Justice, long denied, had finally been delivered, not by a fist, but by a folder, a camera, and the unshakable power of showing up. 6 months later, the diner was different. The sticky floors were clean, the lights were brighter, and a new, younger manager named Maria ran the floor with cheerful efficiency. On the wall by the entrance, in a simple black frame, was a printed document titled The Guardian Angel Policy. It was a zero-tolerance anti-harassment policy for both staff and customers, outlining clear procedures for reporting and immediate consequences for violations. It had been developed in partnership with a local women's advocacy group. The story had become a local legend, a cautionary tale for bullies and a symbol of hope for others. Henderson had been fired the day after the incident, and the diner's owner, facing a torrent of negative press, had embraced the chance for public redemption. The diner was now more popular than ever, attracting a new clientele who appreciated the safe, respectful atmosphere. Lena no longer worked there. She sat in the quiet, sunlit hall of the County Community College Library, a textbook on astrophysics open in front of her. She was no longer looking over her shoulder, no longer dreading the sound of a door opening. The knot of fear in her stomach had been replaced by a quiet confidence. Her tuition and books were paid for in full by the Central County Community Scholarship Fund, an anonymous endowment that had appeared out of nowhere, administered by a quiet lawyer who rode a motorcycle. In the bottom of her backpack, she still kept the bronze star in its velvet box, but next to it now was the spiral notebook, its pages filled with her steady, even script. It was a reminder not of her fear, but of her strength. She had learned that her voice, when paired with discipline and documentation, was a powerful weapon. She had learned that true strength wasn't the ability to intimidate, but the courage to stand silently and bear witness. Far away, in a clubhouse that smelled of leather and camaraderie, Bear sat polishing a piece of chrome. On the right side of his cute, below the road name of his chapter, was a new, small, and unofficial patch. It was expertly embroidered, a simple design that no outsider would understand. It showed a single, steaming coffee cup with a silver pen resting against it. It was a quiet, permanent tribute to the waitress who had faced down fear not with a weapon, but with a notebook, and who had reminded them all that the highest code of honor was to protect those who had the courage to stand on their own. The ripples of that one Friday night continued to spread, a quiet restoration of faith, proving that sometimes, all it takes to fix a broken system is for good people to decide, in unison, to simply show up and pay attention.